What I can announce already is that this talk will be quite different from the former ones that you heard, and probably the ones that you will hear. So this is a kind invitation to step back, to lean back, to zoom out a little bit out of the brain, and to engage in an ethical deliberation and overcome your postprandial tiredness or so. So this will be about neuroscience and AI for a flourishing life. You see this fern from Madeira last week, trying to flourish in its own way. And I will start with a story to make it easy. And it is a story from Thomas Mann, the German novelist. And in 1940, he wrote a novel about the transposed heads. There are two Indian, so it stems from the 11th century. It's an Indian legend. And there are two young men, Nanda and Sridhar Man. They're friends. One is a blacksmith. He's very strong, but not so much intellectually interested. And his friend, Sridhar Man, is a very spiritual man, but neglecting his body in a way. Both of them fall in love with Sita, a young woman. And she chooses Sridhar Man as her husband, and she gets pregnant. Then they go to a travel. They go to a goddess, and they see that Sita actually fell in love with Nanda, with the better, the stronger body in a way. And so Sridhar Man and Nanda decide to decapitate themselves because they are friends and they cannot stand the conflict. Sita sees that, and the goddess decides that she has to rearrange the heads and the bodies. And being very excited, she does it the wrong way. So Sridhar Man's head is now on Nanda's body and vice versa. And now the question arises, who is the husband of Sita and who is the father of her child? What would you decide? What is the identity of the person? Is it the identity of the head, or is it the identity of the body? Or are there two completely new identities? Is the brain the relevant identificator, or is it the body? Let's see. Keep the story in mind. My line of thought now will be, what is the future of digital neuroscience? What do we see through the glasses of ethics? Life ethics as an integrative framework. I will introduce my own ethical approach very quickly, of course. Then I want to conceptualize human life and what AI has not. Then conceptualize human life and scrutinizing a little bit the impact and the influences that it has on research in every of the 4 steps. And then, of course, there will be a conclusion. So I took a very, very impressive and informative review by Katrin Amunds and a lot of others, also Viktor Gilza and probably others who are sitting here in the room, with this publication on the coming decade of digital brain research, a vision for neuroscience at the intersection of technology and computing. I think it's fascinating, and it's really a wonderful overview over what has already been developed during the last century and what will probably be developed and what they are striving to develop. And I just pick out some quotes. So they talk about causal therapies, and Victor in his presentation also talked about causal models and causal mechanisms, how the brain works. The potential of AI, you can read there, is to decipher the organization of consciousness, or the arrival of machines with capacity to simulate consciousness could mean that the hard problem of consciousness can be addressed by simulating the easy problem of consciousness. They refer to David Chalmers. The easy problems of consciousness are those who can be dealt with cognitive sciences. And the hard problem cannot. The hard problem is mainly and eventually that we experience something from the I perspective. I love somebody, I hate somebody, I feel ill or so. And you cannot deal with that with cognitive science. Yeah, you cannot grasp the I perspective and the experience. And Chalmers actually says that no cognitive sciences and neurosciences will capture the heart problem ever, but we'll see. Probably the future neuroscientists can. Another two quotes. Brain stimulation is expected to play a key role in elucidating essential aspects of brain processes by demonstrating the capacity to reproduce them in silico. Yeah, please remember in silico. It's not a living matter, it's a dead matter. And a dead matter is meant to reproduce something that lives. Let's see whether it works. Such as decision making. So I think everyone is used to say that AI can decide something. I doubt. Then they talk about robotic embodiments, or some aspects of the full closed loop of perception, cognition, and action. So those are just a few concepts: consciousness, embodiment, decision-making, and so on, where I now will go into from the ethical perspective, because it is so interesting to see how different disciplines deal with concepts and notions. I will not say that one is better than the other one, but we should be aware of the differences and what we can learn from each other then. So in the same publication, they already name very many ethical questions. Here, for example, privacy, data from persons, mind reading, enhance particular brain states. I found that very interesting about this drug release. That could also be perhaps a wonderful mechanism to enhance certain brain functions. Let's see. Or malfeasance, dual use problems. But there are, of course, a lot of others referring to the dignity of the human being, to autonomy, to justice, for example, access to those technologies. Yeah, we are using high technologies for medical care. In other areas, you even don't have drugs, the simplest drugs. Solidarity, safety, and so on. So a lot of things. But what do we see actually through the glasses of ethics? I love it to ask people what they understand or what they mean when they say ethics. And usually it turns up to be a 20-minute discussion, because to define it is very, very difficult. Let's just, and there's not this one definition. But when you look through the glasses of ethics, you see what a meaningful life shall be, what a good action is, and not a technically good action, but a good action in terms of a flourishing life, of a meaningful life, or what you or what societies perceive as being a good action or a bad action. And you can deal with ethics in a lot of ways. When I'm sitting on a panel, I'm usually asked, what are the limits for these technologies? I find this question for ethics quite boring, because I'm more interested in what should be done and not what should be not done. Yeah. So there are obligations, or there are motivations to do something because of ethical reasons. Ethics is not the one who cuts things and progress and innovation, but it orients in which direction innovation probably should go, or what could be a good idea to do that. So I am the team foster progress. Of course, there can be limits involved, but it's not my primary concern. And with the level of concreteness, you have, of course, the ethical reflections on specific technologies like deep brain stimulation or other issues, or building digital brain twins. But you also can have general concepts, or there are always general concepts underlying these technologies and how they are developed. For example, what is the role of the brain for the human being? When listening to neuroscientists and neuroresearchers, then you often have the impression that the brain is roughly everything the human being must have to work and to function. And if you understand the brain, you understand a lot about the human being. I have my doubts. I think we can understand a lot about the brain, but what it means for the human being and for a flourishing life, that's a next question. Or what is a mental disorder? Is it really the cause of a mental disorder if you find an imbalance in neurotransmitters in the brain? I think it's not astonishing that there is an imbalance or that you find something in the brain, because you find everything in the body. Yeah, where else? But what does that mean for the human being? And is that already then the cause for something? So my focus now will not be on a specific technology and definitely not on ethics review processes by project applications, but on these general concepts and understanding and deliberating the common ethical ground for desirable futures. And I tell you why I start with my ethics approach, and it's called life ethics. It's not a deontology or utilitarianism or virtue ethics or whatever. Our principle at the Center for Life Ethics is that the ethically good means respecting or promoting the unfolding plenitude, beauty, and embeddedness of all life. Why that? Because if you start with justice, if you start with autonomy or dignity, if you start only with the human being, if you start with obligations, if you start with the overall benefit of something like the other ethical theories do, you have a specific ethical principle that other people don't share because they find something else more important. Or you have a specific image of the human being which other folks don't share. Or you have a specific view on the world that other people don't share. So you're, from the beginning, eclectic in a way. But you have a universal claim, so everyone should accept it. So I thought, also in combination with the experiences in policy advice, how can we come to an ethical starting point where everyone can agree, just for the first step? And I think where we can agree is that we are alive. Only few people with a specific disease will deny that they are alive. And what does life mean? Life means that you are developing in time. I think you cannot really disagree on that. We can have different concepts of time, circular time, linear time, and so on, but we develop in time. Life has a lot of facets. You have the bodily, the spiritual, the mind, the emotional, the psychological, the social life, and so on. So life is not only a molecular thing, it has a lot of facets. Then life has always an aesthetic dimension. That's why the beauty comes in. And life is always embedded in an environment, a human or non-human environment. And we want to focus on all life. We don't see that the human life is so special that it should only be taken into account, but it is also embedded in other forms of life. So starting from that, and if that is fulfilled in a way, then we talk about the flourishing life. So when I talk about the flourishing life, I mean these four aspects of the living being. But then, of course, we will all disagree in one respect or another what unfolding plenitude and so on concretely means in a specific application context. And here that's a very interesting South American approach, the pluriverse. It's from the Zapatista movement in Mexico. And they talk not about pluralism or the plurality, but about the pluriverse in contrast to the universe, because they want that we have a world in which many worlds fit. Yeah, so it's not necessary that we all live the same life and that we all want to live the same life or that we share the concept of the concrete manifestation of a flourishing life, but we should be able to discuss about it. So if we disagree, if we have a conflict, let's explain each other what we understand respectively under unfolding beauty and so on. Then we understand each other better. Then we understand better where the point of conflict is. And either we can solve it or we can live beside each other, let the other one be, or we are convinced that the other one has a good point and that we could adjust our concepts. So it is, this principle, a discursive starting point. You cannot deduce from that principle what the right ethical answer to every question is, but you can exclude things like racism, extractivism, so taking all the resources from the natural resources from Earth so that other people cannot live or the Earth is destroyed, or killing someone only to have own benefits or so. So that is obviously against this principle. But in other situations, there are many possibilities where a good ethical answer can come. And regarding our topic, we have to ask, what significance do neuroscience and AI have for the unfolding plenitude, beauty, and embeddedness of all life? And that leads me to the conceptualizing of human life. The biological view in life sciences is very common. Yeah, you have it also in the virtual brain, twins in a way, from basic neuroscience to clinical use. You see their low dopamine levels are thought to be responsible for positive psychotic symptoms in schizophrenia. Cortex are thought to cause the negative symptoms. So this is obviously another causal interpretation than we have from philosophy, where we are. So I would ask, where does this dysfunction come from? Why is there an imbalance? Or why are there low dopamine levels? Yeah, so for me, this is already rather a symptom or a sign, or in between a circular causality or so, than the cause or so. It's not a critique, it's just to point to the different understandings. But the biological view has a very strong one in it got it in the last centuries. And I think if you look around, life sciences is only a biological sciences, and life ethics is contrasted to that because life is so much more. Then, after the biological view proved to be very helpful, but not encompassing for doing good medicine, the biopsychosocial view came up, also in the WHO definition of health. But they didn't explain how these three areas relate to each other. Yeah, how does biological relate to psychological and to social? Here, the WHO definition is health is a state of complete, wonderful, physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This is more a guiding principle than a philosophical definition in a narrow sense. But it also doesn't say how these areas relate to each other. And that's where the ecological view comes in, where you have a horizontal and vertical circular causality. What does that mean? It means you have the basic level of molecules. They sum up to cells. They sum up to organs. They sum up to the organism. And the brain is just one organ. And the whole organism on every level is looking for or striving for homeostasis with the environment. The molecular level, the cellular level, the organ level, and of course also the organism. If you have a reductionist view, then you think that you can explain the organism by going down to the smaller parts, to the cells or molecules. If you're not following a reductionist view, you say every level has its own right, every level has its own complexity, and you cannot deduce one from the other. They have a circular causality, they influence each other. But if you think, for example, of consciousness, then this emerges from a complexity of other issues, but it cannot be explained by them. Yeah, there is something new coming up. And it makes clear also the embeddedness. Individuals, be it the amoeba or the human being, is always embedded in the environment. It was the German philosopher Hans Jonas who, in originally 1973, published a philosophy of life called Organism and Freedom, Approaches to a Philosophical Biology. And I find it very insightful what he says about life and about the features of life. And here again, depends on my stay in Madeira last week, you have a rock and a turtle. The rock is not a living being, according at least to our view. And the material makes its identity. So the material is identical with the identity, with the unity of the rock. It doesn't change, of course, over the centuries with the contact to the water, but it stays as the identity. Colombo, the turtle born 1958 in Galapagos, is a living being. The material changes all the time. There's metabolism, a metabolism that the rock hasn't. But the identity nevertheless stays the same. So it stays this turtle, although nothing of the material will stay the same over the years. It changes. The same with us. Our cells, our molecules, our organs are metabolized through and through. But although this is changing, our identity stays, our being an individual. And this metabolism, this difference between dead material and living material, I think is a very important one. And we will probably come back to that when talking about AI. So life is, as metabolizing continuity of an individual, has already on this very, very basic level, a kind of freedom, a freedom from material. But it is at the same time dependence from material substance, because you need your food, you need your nutrition and so on. You need the exchange, the oxygen from the environment. So freedom and dependence always comes together. What comes from that? That you have to go outside. So a computer can stay there. It doesn't care whether it gets oxygen or so. It needs some current, but otherwise it's this material. Yeah, it's hardware and software. But we as living organisms have to be oriented outside and see where we get our nutrition. Already the amoeba knows where adequate environments are and where it can survive, because every living organism tends to want to survive. The fourth one is that even the one-cell organism has kind of a consciousness of being an individual in an environment, because it has to move, it has to exchange and so on. So there's a very, very basic notion of mind already in the very first development of living organisms. It's the life-mind continuity thesis. So it's not that all of the sudden, when becoming a human being, you get your mind or your consciousness or so, but there is a rough origin of consciousness and of mind already in the one-cell organism. Just from the fact that there is an inner and an outer world, that there is this freedom and the dependency at the same time. And the fifth feature of life is that you have necessarily the horizon of time, what I already told you when talking about the developing, the unfolding of life. So you have the look outwards and you have the look forward, because you will sustain your life, you want to sustain your life, and this is only possible in time. And now I want to introduce to you the 5E cognition to get a grasp of how to conceptualize human life and then to approach it when trying to understand, for example, mental disorders or doing research on consciousness and so on. So first of all life is embodied in a living organism. It is not in the brain, and there's nothing represented in a philosophical sense in the brain. There is not an image there or so, but the body is an integral part of being conscious in this world. The brain itself has no children, cannot play piano, cannot feel anything. It needs the body. And only this body in the world, with this vertical and horizontal circular causality, leads to consciousness. So you're embodied in a living organism. And you get information, you get sensory impressions, but you then translate them into motor, also into movements. So you realize what you feel or what you think or what you feel you should do through acting. So it's also, again, this circular issue and an integrated issue. And the limit of your body is not the skin necessarily, but if you use an instrument, the most outside point of your consciousness is at the tipping point of the instrument. So if you write something, it's not your finger, it's the tipping of the pencil. Or if you do surgery, even remote surgery, your consciousness and your extended mind is at the tipping point of the instrument you use. So that's also interesting that we can, as organisms with a central organ, with a brain, being a part of the human being and being a moderating, not a controlling or so, or rarely controlling organ, that we can go beyond our bodily limits. And we are embedded always in situations and in environments, and we are emotive. So affectivity is always present. We are touched by the environment, but we also select the environment. So even if two of us are sitting here in front of you, we will see different things although we can agree that all of you are sitting here, but we will have different perceptions. We will have different attentions. We will weigh things in a different way. And this comes then to this graph. The micro level means the physiological one, where the brain and the organism are in exchange with each other, and you can scrutinize that from the third person perspective. As a researcher, you can say something about that, but that's not about experiencing something. On the meso level, you catch the first and second person perspective. You experience yourself and you're in exchange with another one who is part of your environment. You talk to him or her, you touch him or her. It's the embodied subjectivity, the unity of body and soul. As a third person perspective, on the right side, you can only research or understand the body, but you can hardly grasp the soul or the mind or the first person perspective. Actually, that cannot be grasped eventually. You can try to approach it with empathy, but you can never get really control of the first person perspective. And at the macro level, there is this intersubjective embodiment and social interaction between two persons. And that is then, of course, the dialogue. Having in mind this 5E cognition, we can discuss later, but that is my opinion, is that AI has a lot of that not. It has not a value-based freedom and autonomy. You have autonomous cars, but they are not autonomous in a way that they can say, well, I will not be a car anymore, I want to become a nurse. So they cannot have their own goals, the autonomy in the full sense, in the ethical sense. So AI cannot be responsible. It has no feelings, desires, hopes, or regrets. It can simulate them with a programmed voice or specific vocabulary or so. And it is wonderful, and it's very able to deceive people in being empathetic, sometimes even more than the relative or the husband or the wife. But it's a simulation. Yeah. They have no body or organism. Even a robot has not an organism, a living organism in the sense I described. It has no soul or mind, let alone a unity of body and soul or a mind in an organism. It can pretend to say I, it can be programmed to say I and to choose the word I and infer the word I to say it in a large language model, but it has no I, lived experience and consciousness in itself. No embodied empathy, compassion, hate, or love. It cannot suffer, even if you could program a robot that has tears running down or so. And we will probably discuss in the panel discussion also what a simulated consciousness could be, and how we should deal with entities that can simulate that. A robot doesn't care for the future. It doesn't think, oh, where do I go to holidays in 2 years' time or so? Yeah, it's just in the moment and inferring what comes in. And it has not a sense of meaningfuls or failure. There's no regret. If you ask ChatGPT something and it says something wrong and you say, so you're wrong, then it says, well, sorry, but actually I don't care. Yeah, then I suggest another solution. So AI is about data and information, and what humans can better is make really something out of that. So if you have data, you know not really a lot. You do have to have a context to make out of it an information. Then you have to give this information a meaning, then you get knowledge. If you evaluate the knowledge and weigh it against your value background, for example, you get an insight. And if this insight gets a purpose, you can take a decision. So AI cannot actually, in the full sense of the word, decide something responsibly because it cannot weigh. It has no values. Yeah, it is not an embodied being. We can decide that we use an algorithmic system in a way that it can put through inferred results immediately. But that's our decision. An AI only can count and calculate and infer. It cannot perceive, it cannot decide, it cannot think, it cannot weigh up. And I think that's one really important issue in a way. I don't expect that societies will change their terminology, and this terminology is brought up for a purpose, that we can talk about later. But if we talk about AI and about machines and those tools as if they were humans and as if they had human capabilities, then we have not to wonder how mighty and powerful they become. Yeah, because then we treat them like humans or like really powerful tools. What they are, but as tools for our purposes. So it was Edward Osborne Wilson, a US biologist, who famously said, we are drowning in information while starving in wisdom. Now, it's not the amount of data that makes us more clever. I come to the conclusion, and the research, not actually the conclusion, that slide is wrong, but it doesn't matter here. Barry Schwartz, a US psychologist, said a theory about the universe doesn't change the course of planets, but a theory about human nature changes human nature. And that's why I find this thinking about conceptualizing human life so important, because how we think about AI and how we think about humans will change the way we behave, will change the way we look at humans, will change the way we treat them, will change our societal institutions, how we build education, how we shape our work world, and so on. And that's why I think it's really important to think about our image of human nature and the human being. And that comes into research as well. And this is perhaps a little bit more practical for your purposes. So a research process usually starts roughly with a research question. So which question do you ask? What drives you to ask this question and not another one? Planning and doing, which methods and instruments do you use? The results and interpretations are driven by your interest, by decisions you made before, and those are necessarily value-laden. They're not neutral. And the conclusions also depend on your view on the world. Let's have an example. So look at the research question. For example, what are the causal mechanisms underlying a mental disorder? According to the biological view, you look for chemical imbalances. According to the biopsychosocial view, you look, for example, for cerebral and mental binding dysfunctions, for social behaviors, and so on. And according to the ecological view, you look for disorders of the embodied self in relationship. So look at these differences, whether you look at chemical imbalance or at disorders of the embodied self in a relationship. Yeah, a completely different question. Planning and doing. According to the biological view, we already saw that we have a lot of wonderful instruments to learn about the chemical imbalance. We get biomarkers, neural networks, signal patterns, and so on. According to the biopsychosocial view, we have different analyses, also mental and social components without relations to each other, unfortunately. But we get profiles, social profiles, biological profiles, psychological profiles. All of a sudden, for example, socioeconomic data come in that are not covered by the biological view. And according to the ecological view, you gather data from the first, second, and third person perspective. You introduce, for example, qualitative interviews to learn more about the first person perspective of a, for example, schizophrenic patient. You do a biological and phenomenological analysis of relations between the mind, body, and world. So a different question, and of course, a different planning and doing, different methodologies. That's why I appreciate so much, for example, the Virtual Brain Twin project that Victor mentioned in the beginning, because there we can bring all these things together, what Karl Jaspers called the explanatory pluralism. Yeah, it's not that one thing is not necessary, but it is the togetherness of these different issues. With regard to the results and interpretation, the biological view finds biochemical causes of a mental disorder, yeah, because that's what that one looked for. The biopsychosocial view finds biological, psychological, and social causes, where you live, how much you earn, what you do, and so on. But they cannot relate it really to each other. And according to the ecological view, you find the ecological causes of a mental disorder, or a disorder of an embodied self in relationship. Then, for example, you see, regarding the embodiment explanation and feature, that depression actually is kind of a somatic disorder, because the relationship to the body and the not ability to move in the way you want to move, the heaviness of the body, the unrelatedness to the world becomes more important. And all of a sudden, especially with the ecological view, you use different therapies. You use bodily therapies like dance therapy, music therapy, and so on, in addition, perhaps, to drugs. So from the ecological view, you can come back to the biological view. That's also interesting. And the consequences, yeah, you have, I already mentioned it, for the ecological view, you have an integrated approach of biofunctional methods and therapeutic interactions. You not only use one, but perhaps two or three. According to the psychosocial view, you have medication, psychotherapy, social interventions, but they're not really related to each other, but already a nice combination. And the biofunctional interventions, according to the biological view, I think we had impressive examples for that already. So now remember life ethics. So how can neuroscience and AI really contribute to the unfolding plenitude, beauty, and embeddedness of all life? When we use them as a tool for the aims and purposes we really have. So it's wonderful, of course, in basic research to learn something without a purpose. It's interesting to learn something about the brain or to program an algorithmic system or so. But in general and in the whole, we should ask also as a society, spending a lot of money there, where should that lead us? To what do we want to contribute? Because the money we spend there, we cannot depend for another purpose. Yeah. I just want to contextualize it a little bit so that everyone, even with a small project, can think, what is my contribution to a flourishing life? Where can it lead to? And even knowledge, even basic knowledge can lead to that. So there are myriad questions, of course. How do we understand the role of the brain? What are our concepts of mental disorders? How do we treat affected people? How do we include them into society? How do we conceptualize AI in comparison to humans? How do we allocate scarce resources for research and care? And what do we really find important in our individual and societal lives? And very important, who defines that? I think especially in AI, having in mind the tech giants who bring forward the technologies and we use them and we find them wonderful and we have all our mobile phones and tablets and laptops and so on. But do we really think hard about who defines what a flourishing life is? I don't know whether you saw the video film, The Selfish Ledger from Google DeepMind. Perhaps afterwards on the panel we can talk about that. It is that they define what a good life is. And they want to have not only the genes, the selfish genes from Richard Walking, they want to have all the data in the ledger so that they can influence the behavioral patterns in a way that individuals and societies behave in a way that they find interesting and good. But I think that's not the way it goes. We should all define for ourselves and for our groups and societies what a good and flourishing life is. So to whom do we give the money and the power to define and influence what a flourishing life is? So let's come back to Nanda and Sridharman. So a wise man decided that Sita is still married to Sridharman, so to the head, because the head is decisive with the brain and so on. But as reality turned out, is that the heads and the bodies both changed. Yeah, so the Sridharman head didn't take care of this strong body of the blacksmith. And the body didn't give the adequate input to the spiritual head of Sridharman. And then Sita saw the development of Sridharman, and again she wanted to be with Nanda and went to him in the desert. And the final, the end of the novel is not very nice. They all killed themselves and were burned. They couldn't deal with the situation. But I think the question of the novel, not the end, but the question of the novel is very pertinent. So my conclusion would be for this keynote that the more we learn about the brain as an organ and AI as an artifact, the more we should cherish the abundance of flourishing as a living organism. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think they can serve themselves.
Thanks for this very nice talk. I had a question about what we are projecting into all the AI and developing tools on, because somehow we are projecting some part of humans' concept through languages and many other aspects. And as it has been mentioned yesterday, large language model work well, but autonomous cars not so well, because it's interacting with some reality that is outside of our world of concept, while languages is really from human to human. So somehow how this is a way to project something which only relates to concepts that come from us and from our representations, and how there is some choice to be made in what we project into it, which is not necessarily an image of some external reality in which we are living. So do you have any...
Do you mean how we look at AI, how we project our own desires or our own concepts on AI systems, or do you ask for the concepts that go into the training of the AIs?
No, it's how we built it, really, and how this create a kind of feedback loop with.
Yeah.
But it starts with the way we are building it.
Yeah. So I really think that this is also related to the question of the power of who does what. It depends on the data we use to train them, and we get the feedback from them. And that's where the Barry Schwartz dictum comes in, because they convey a worldview that we then take because it's comfortable. It's a commodity. Yeah, it's wonderful. I don't have to think anymore. There's a video on TikTok, projecting two friends coming to each other, and they even don't know how to say hello again. So they have their phone and they ask, how do I say hello to my friend? And then they get the answer from ChatGPT, and then they tell it the friend, and how should I answer? so that's a little bit, satire, so cynical or so. But it depends on the application field. There's not the AI. Yeah, AI in neuroscience, AI in building a virtual brain twin is something completely different to an LLM that we use, or to a search machine, or to a work procedure, to an optimization of a workflow or so. But I think we should be careful and vigilant and aware that they shape our reality. Yeah, they confront us with these systems and the environment also on the laptop. And even the two-dimensionality of this surface is something different than playing with a three-dimensional play. There's a wonderful experiment with two cats going around, young cats going around. One can go himself and the other one not. So they take the same path, they have the same environment, and then they are put outwards. And the one who could go itself can manage a very small path, and the other one always drops right or left. Yeah, because she couldn't embody and integrate the sensor-motoric unity. And that's a little bit the way AI does. It takes us from, or it could take us away from going ourselves. Yeah, and then we are not fit to go through our lives.
I was listening to this presentation that kind of raised a pretty important question, I guess. So I have several points maybe in this like structure. So first probably would be that some companies state that in near future they will be able to duplicate humans, like to ensure immortality by transferring human brain and so on. But in that case, it would be just digital clones. And if you would check headlines on Google and all, you can see that let's say in South Korea, people right now are talking with digital clones of their dead relatives and falling in depression and everything. In UK, a teenager killed himself after 2 months of encouragement from ChatGPT and so on. And my point would be that okay, so we can create digital copies of human brains or just imitate the human activity, but we need boundaries for that. And at the same point, where would be those boundaries? And I don't know, like this is like a moral question, I guess. And at the same point, there's a Lithuanian writer who said that every country has enough fools for themselves or enough for the export. So the thing is that if we create AI, we need to account for the things that, okay, we need to think that someone will be stupid enough to do something stupid with that AI. So we need to evaluate everything into account. And based on that, I'm interested. What's your opinion regarding this question? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. A lot of aspects were in that. So first of all, there are people who think that if you can transfer all the information from the brain in silico, like in the film Transcendence with Matt Damon, I suppose, then you can live forever. And there is a whole also philosophical post-humanist and transhumanist movement and school that says, yes, that's the essence of the human being. And then the human lives forever. So the selfish ledger or whatever you will call that. I don't think that this is longevity or eternal life, but we have to see that there are people who think that. And there's another issue. Even if you see fake videos or deep fakes and so on, people more and more tend not to take that serious that it is a fake video. They don't decide according to is it true or not. They decide according to does it please me or not? Do I favor that or not? And I think this is a real danger, not only for the individual getting, for example, convinced that he should commit suicide, but also for societies and for democracy. It was Hannah Arendt who told us already in the 50s that not the fascism or the communist is the danger for democracy or prone to autocracies, but the one who doesn't decide between true and false anymore. And if truth is no criteria anymore or reality for how we communicate with each other, then we don't have a shared ground to talk with each other, because then everything is arbitrary. And how could we deal with that? There have to be a lot of approaches to deal with that. First is education from the beginning, critical thinking, being in contestation, in a good, rational contestation, fighting with each other for good values in a democratic way, being able to deal with conflicts, but also to set limits and say, well, societies decide that we do not want to produce, for example, robots that seem to be human beings. Yeah, and substitute human beings as friends. So there are already so many novels about these constellations. It's very interesting. We can learn a lot from that. I think it must be a voluntary empowerment to deal with these challenges, and also limits where it really steps across borders that we don't want to stand anymore.
So, speaking of abuse of power, I'm going to use my own and use the remaining time to ask one question of my own. Apologies for delaying my chair duties, but I have so many questions. I had to reduce them to one. You seem to view biological and artificial systems as belonging to completely different moral categories. You're probably familiar with this ship of Theseus version of brains, where you start replacing a human brain neuron by neuron with artificial components. Where along this process do you see the line or the gray area between something that has moral value and something that doesn't?
So an organism exists out of a lot of issues. It's not about only one neuron after the other. Yeah, or I get your question wrong. But do you ask for the relationship between artificial, so for example, a prosthesis?
No, I'm asking, so let's say that I replace each neuron in my brain, sequentially. First one, then the next, and so on, until all my brain consists only of artificial neurons. At what point do I use...
What is artificial in your
a
technology?
Little chip that takes the same input as a biological neuron and produces the same output. It's in principle possible, also in practice, I would say. At what point do I lose my moral value?
I don't think that I can answer that now all of the sudden, because we could discuss that afterwards or so. Because first we have to clarify what the moral value of an individual is. Yeah, a moral value in terms of dignity, or a moral value in terms of an instrumental value for other people, a moral value really for or in itself. So we just first have to clarify what moral value of an individual means. So that neurons are artificial is not against having a moral value in principle. Whether it is something else than having dignity must be discussed.